The most frightening people in any room aren't the ones who get angry. They're not the ones who draw hard lines or make their displeasure visible. Those people are navigable. You know what they want, you know what they're protecting, and you can move around the edges of it. The ones who genuinely unsettle people are the ones who forgive all the way. Without conditions you can see from the outside, not because they've decided the harm wasn't real, because they've been somewhere most people haven't and came back different enough that the usual machinery stops working on them. I spent years in hospice work before I understood this. I thought I was watching people become softer near the end, less defended, the sharp edges worn smooth. It took a long time to see what was actually happening in a few of those rooms. Some of them were becoming impossible to manipulate. Here's what Jung noticed, and he was careful about how he said it. Most of us carry unintegrated shadow material into every relationship. By shadow, he didn't mean evil or the worst version of yourself. He meant the parts of your psyche you've declined to examine, the capacity for harm you haven't acknowledged, the resentments you've called principles, the fear you've been calling wisdom. This material creates a specific dynamic in relational life. We project it outward. We take what we can't hold inside ourselves and locate it in other people, where it can be monitored and managed at a distance. And here's what matters for understanding why the complete forgiver frightens people. Almost every mechanism of social control depends on the other person's projections being active. The guilt trip works because you have something unexamined to feel guilty about. The emotional leverage works because you're carrying material that can be pressed on. These mechanisms don't require malice. They're less like weapons and more like keys. They only turn in locks that exist. When someone has genuinely integrated their shadow, when they've looked at the full inventory of what they're capable of and accepted it as part of the catalogue, those keys stop fitting. Not because they've become invulnerable, because they've already done the accounting. Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. That density is what makes projection necessary, but this works in both directions. The person who has learned to hold it, who has carried the weight of their own full nature without flinching, that person has nothing left to offload onto you. And when you try to offload onto them, it doesn't land. This is what makes the complete forgiver so disorienting. They're not forgiving you from a position of moral elevation. They're forgiving you from a position of recognition. They see what you did and they recognize it. Not as an abstract failure, but as something they understand from the inside because they've found their own version of it. And because they've faced that in themselves, your version of it doesn't trigger the reaction you were reaching for. Jung noted that projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. The person who has stopped projecting doesn't function as a mirror. You look for your reflection, it's the anger you expected, the guilt you anticipated, and it isn't there. And when the mirror isn't there, you're left alone with whatever you brought into the room. I had a patient in hospice, a retired school teacher, late 70s, declining over several months. He'd spent years estranged from his son. Long separation, the kind that starts over something specific and metastasizes into an identity. By the time I knew this man, he had arrived somewhere. He listened to people without looking for the weapon in what they were saying. His son came eventually. Long drive, clearly under family pressure that had finally moved him. I wasn't in the room, but in hospice work, the rooms aren't quite sealed. What I expected, what I think the son expected, was either a reconciliation or a reckoning. The ledger finally balanced, one way or another. What I heard instead was the son's voice rising. He was pushing at something that wasn't pushing back. He catalogued old failures, described specific wrongs, working himself toward the anger or the guilt or the desperate bid for reconciliation that would locate the power back where he'd expected to find it. His father, in a voice that was quiet and not unkind, kept not giving him any of it. The son left before the visit was finished. I walked out of that wing slowly. I'd been in rooms where people screamed, where they said things that couldn't be unsaid, where the air felt different afterward. This felt different in the other direction. The silence the son left behind wasn't empty. It was full of something he hadn't been prepared for and didn't have words for yet. I've thought about that exchange many times since. What became unbearable wasn't the lack of resolution, it was the absence of a lever. The son had organized himself around the expectation that his father owed him a reaction. Anger would have confirmed the injury, a desperate plea would have confirmed his power. Either response would have given him a role, a way of orienting to the man in the bed. The forgiveness that was actually in the room did none of that. It was the presence of someone who had already gone all the way through the thing and put it down. And that made the son a person in a story that had been completed quietly without him. There's an important distinction worth holding on to because the surface of this is easy to perform. Jung was explicit about it. Consciousness of the shadow, he wrote in Ion, requires considerable moral effort. The forgiveness that comes before that effort isn't what I'm describing. The person who forgives quickly, who moves through the injury without sitting with it, who locates their peace by deciding it didn't really matter. That person hasn't integrated anything. They've suppressed the wound under language that sounds like resolution, and the shadow gets denser from that kind of management, not lighter. What I witnessed in that room was the other kind, the kind that requires having actually been to the bottom of your own capacity for harm and staying there until something metabolized. That process is not gentle. It doesn't feel like forgiveness while it's happening. But when it's finished, the product is someone who is no longer organizing their sense of self around the injury. And people who are still organizing theirs around injuring others find that condition almost unbearable to be near, not through judgment. Through contrast, you'll encounter someone like this. Eventually, if you haven't already, they'll forgive you something, and there'll be a moment where you realize it isn't relief you're feeling. It's something that asks more of you than anger would have, because anger is a negotiation. It keeps the account open. It means there's still a transaction available, a position you can take, a way to be involved. Complete forgiveness closes the account on terms you didn't set, in a currency you weren't expecting. Not threat, not judgment. Just the undeniable presence of someone who went somewhere difficult and came back without needing anything from you about it. That is what unsettles people. And it should also tell you something real about what it means to be a person who can do it.